Welcome back to another video here on Free Will Photos. Today, what we're going to do is take a look at editing a raw image using Affinity Photo. So I'm just going to click, drag, and drop it inside of Affinity Photo. And Affinity's going to take a second and render that file. I want you to know that whenever you drop a photo into Affinity Photo, you open a raw file at least. It opens the develop persona for the raw file. All right. This is the workspace. Now, I'm not going to go into extreme detail on all of these things. That'll be for a later video. I just want to show you how to edit a raw image pretty quick inside of Affinity Photo if this is one of your editors of choice. Now, I personally leave the histogram selected for what I want to view because I'm just here to do a quick edit on the image. Before we dive deep into these particular sliders over here, let me show you a view setting that's extremely helpful. This little last one with the two half moons or half circles, it gives you a before and after preview. Now, I haven't figured out a way to toggle the before and put the before image on the left and the after image on the right, but you just have to know that your after image or the one that you're editing. So if I pull up on the exposure, you can see that that's happening over here. And this is the original on the right. I would love to figure out how to toggle that. So if you know how to toggle that, please, someone let me know in the comments because I would be greatly appreciative. Now, the reason why this is so handy is because as I make edits to this, I can see where the original image started and to see if I'm pulling it way too much in any one direction. So let's go ahead and edit this photo now. With the exposure slider, it works just like any other exposure slider. It is pretty aggressive, so you don't need more than a stop is what I've found in either direction if you got a good exposure overall with your original image, which this is a pretty good exposure for the location. It was a pretty dim room. I don't know what it's called. So I'm going to leave that as is. Probably just pull down on this a little bit. Now, the black point does work a little different than other programs. When you pull left on the black point, you're actually removing black from the image, and that takes away some of the contrast and the punchiness. So in order to add black into an image using Affinity Photos persona or develop persona for raw files, you have to pull it to the right. And that's okay. I mean, if you just take a look at the gradients here, you can see that if you pull it to the left, you're adding white, and if you pull it to the right, you're adding black. So to add that black point in, you have to pull it to the right, and that just helps darken the image a little bit and really drive some punch. Now, the brightness slider works very similar to the exposure slider. Once upon a time in Lightroom, there used to be something known as fill light, and that's essentially what this works as. It's a more subtle approach to adding light to the image overall or darkening it. So it really is just brightness. How bright do you want that exposure to become? So I haven't found a happy medium of which one works best. I usually go back and forth when I edit between exposure and brightness. But if you edit your exposure and then you add in brightness, you may find that, well, now I may need to add or take away some exposure. And it is perfectly fine if your brightness goes past where you made your exposure setting, because brightness is so much more subtle than exposure. So I think that's pretty good. Looking at the before and after, I've just brightened up the image overall. So my exposure is set where I would like it to be. The next one down is enhance. And this is the contrast slider. Now, contrast, very straightforward. Pull to the left, it takes away contrast. Pull to the right, it adds contrast. This is subjective, and you know me, I like more punchy images. So I pull my contrast just a little bit, And the clarity slider works the exact same way. The more you pull it to the right, the more clarity you add into the image. And the more you pull it to the left, the less clarity you have in the image. Now, there's a lot of little details in this photo that I do want to enhance. So I'm going to pull the clarity up just a little bit because, and I'll zoom in here so you can see what it is that I was pulling up that clarity for. So right here on this little pedal, when I have the clarity off over here on the before photo, you can see that it's a little dull. It's not as punchy or sharp, but over here on the after photo, you can see that it's just a little bit more crisp and clear. And that's all. I just want to make sure that I have a little bit more clarity going on in those areas. So, and you could also really see it without even zooming in over here on the far left. So that's clarity, saturation and vibrance. There's no difference to how this works from other programs other than the way that it actually implements it. So saturation, I find that it is less aggressive than most programs. Like I just added 20%, and this is still, in my opinion, a pretty tasteful colored image compared to the original. Like, yeah, the reds are getting a little bit oversaturated, but nothing that a HSL can't adjust if you pull down on the reds a little bit. But that's just something to keep in mind, that this is a little bit more subtle when it comes to how it implements the saturation. The vibrance, on the other hand, it is, if the saturation is subtle, the vibrance is extremely subtle, because here I am adding in essentially 100% of the bar, but it's up to 50%, and you could barely tell a difference. Let me reset the the saturation slider. And if you look at the two, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. If you look at the two, the red bowls, I'm going to pull the vibrance down, and this is where vibrance started, and that's what vibrance at full capacity. I can't see the difference. So if you find a photo where you edit the vibrance and you can see a huge difference, then please let me know. But I think in Affinity Photo, you can almost leave vibrance alone. I guess it's really impacting those blues in there for this sponge. But if I were to pull up on the saturation, those blues are also getting impacted, and the rest of the images as well. And I can see what's happening a lot better. So just personal preference. I don't really do too much color editing in this particular module. If I'm going to modify the color, I'd prefer to do that as a live filter over on the pixel side of Affinity Photo. So the next item is the white balance. Now, I'm not going to belabor this. White balance is exactly how it works with any other software. You pull to the right, it changes your warmth, and if you pull to the left, then it changes your coolness, right? And then the tint slider. But I was okay with the way that the white balance was shot on this image, so I'm good to go here. What I will note, however, on the left-hand side, there is the white balance tool. If you click on this, you can select what should have been neutral in the image, and then it will do its best to auto-correct the white balance. I personally have not found a good image where that works, so that is fine. I just haven't found one. I usually get pretty decent white balance exposure out of camera, so I'm not overly concerned with that. So I'm just going to leave that alone and unchecked. The next one is shadows and highlights. Now, again, this is another one of those tools that works exactly how you would expect them to. If I pull it to the left, it's going to add shadows. If I pull it to the right, it's going to remove them or open up the shadows. Depending on your image, I don't have too many shadows in this photo that I want to open, because if I open up these shadows, then the entire image just becomes dull and not very interesting to look at. In fact, I would probably darken the shadows on this image so that way I bring more attention to this red bowl, which compositionally I was using that to draw the eye of the viewer because it was in stark contrast to the complementary colors in the image with the green, the blue, and the butterflies on there. So that was intentional that I photographed the red bowl to take up most of the frame. Then, of course, when I pull on the highlights, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. Same idea. If you look over here on the little lip of the bowl, you can see that as I pull up on the highlights, it gets brighter. That's preference. Use this however you want for your image. I personally don't think I need it, so I'm going to reset this by double clicking, and I'm just going to leave it with the shadows lowered because I think that that's a better look overall for this particular image. And then the last thing down here is profiles. I'm not going to go into these because this is very specific to a workflow. Personally, I leave this unchecked, but if you needed to change your color profile, especially if you know that you're going to be printing and you need to go into one of the wider color gamuts, then this is where you would be able to do that from your raw image. But I'm personally not going to mess with that because I don't need it. The next tab is the lens tab. Now, the lens that I was using is not found inside of Affinity Photo, which that's not a big deal because I don't see any distortion in the image overall. But if you did have a lens and you wanted to search for it, you can just type in the name. Like I was using a Tamron 35 to 150. And as you can see, they have a 35 to 70. And I could apply any of these to the image and it would try to do the correction based off of what's in here. But I personally haven't found any need for that. Now, what I haven't done is search for any of the Canon RF lenses, which I don't think those are in here yet. And this is Affinity Photo 2, by the way. So, if you have, okay, there are some RF lenses in here. So there's a handful of them, the 85 f2. So if you have a Canon RF system, I imagine the Nikon Z, if I can spell, or I was spelling Zycon, and we'll come down here, Nikkor Z. So yeah, they do have some of the new lens in here. So if you have one of those systems, then and lens for them, then you'll be able to find those. But a good amount of lens are available here inside of the lens profile. But if your lens isn't, then that's fine. You get access to all these other lens correction tools, and you can use them as you need to modify your image. Now, I'm not going to go into that because, again, I don't need to do that for this image. And this is trial and error. Every image is going to be different. So I wouldn't be able to do a very general approach to that. The next tab is details. Now, when it comes to details, you have the refinement tool, and this is like adding sharpening. All right. Think of it that way. So you set your radius, and you can set your radius to whatever you need to. Let me zoom in here. And we'll just look over here because I think that's where we're going to see it the most. And it doesn't do anything until you change the amount. And once you change the amount, you can see that it's really trying to add some micro contrast over into this area with those little specks of dust. Now, the radius for me, I think, is set too high, and it is what it is. Ultimately, use this as you believe it will work best for your image. I can't tell you what the right setting is because you just have to use that, and that's no different than adding sharpening to any of your images. The next one is noise reduction. Noise reduction works just the way that you want it to. I personally don't see any noise that I want to remove, so I'm not going to do that for this image. But you would just pull up on the luminance, adjust your luminance details and contribution overall to get the look that you're going for. And if you have color noise, then you have some tools here for that. Now, if you wanted to add noise, which I don't, but maybe you're working on an image where you're like, yeah, I need to add some noise, then you can go ahead and throw that in there by clicking this icon or checking this little box. And then we get to one of my favorite tabs, which is the tone tab. Now, you know that I am a fan of curves, and if I can modify the image using a curves module that I can remove nodes as I work through the edit, then that is great. And that is what Affinity Photo allows for. Now, I personally would not modify the curves here in the develop persona, but for today's purposes, I'm going to show you the power of just being able to come in here and make those modifications. So I'm doing a very, very generic S curve, and I may even bring up some of the midtones here. And I like the edgy look that I am getting. Now, you can get to all of these channels, and what I may want to do is pull down and add in some more greens to the image. But I think I want to protect some of these areas. So I'm just going to pull that up and maybe add some greens into the highlight, because I think there's some brighter colors in there, right? Brighter greens? No, not really. It's really impacting this area right here. So trying to see if I can get some realistic looking green color, which I think that might be okay. All right, so I'll leave it like that. And then I'll come to the blue channel, and I usually add a little bit of warmth by pulling down on the blues. And I'm just trying to see where that works. But by doing so, I'm really impacting those greens. So I may need to come to the green channel and just push up on my greens a little bit. And this is a very, very rough work on modifying those colors. So if I turn off, or I'm sorry, those channels, if I turn this off and on, you can see that changes a lot. But let's say I'm like, I don't like this anymore. I can click on it and hit the delete key. And then I can come back to the blue channel. I can click on here and hit the delete key. And that is what I love about having editable curves. So if I don't like any of the work that I did in the channels, I can just come and delete all of that. And now I am just left with my master channel. And that is the S curve that I did on there. So I'm going to turn off the curves because I'm not really feeling that edit. You can do black and white. You click it and you get all of your color editing capabilities here. So if I wanted that red bowl to go black, look at that. These are a little heavy-handed, so you don't need much of an adjustment to really get something going. Like if you look at that, I added 11% or 10% at this point to the overall image. And look at how it just blew out that bowl. And, you know, so if I wanted to make the greens darker in the image, I can pull those all the way down. And that adjustment was a little bit more subtle. I know that sponge is blue, so I can make that dark and then that gets weird. Or I can make it brighter and even that gets weird. So you got to really pay attention to what it is that you're doing when it comes to using this black and white adjustment. The next one here in the tones module is your split toning, and you have highlights and hue, shadows and hue, or the hue of your highlights or the hue of your shadow. where you add in a color and then you pull up on the saturation and you can see it's adding it into the highlights. And I can change that color to do whatever I want. I think that the split toning in here is not really worth using. It's better to use it out in the raster module of Affinity Photo. The last tab is overlays, and overlays is okay. But again, I think that you're better using your local adjustments or making local adjustments in Affinity Photo Studio or the raster version of it. I find these to be a little clunky. All right. And the way that you use them, should you choose, is you click on it, and down here at the bottom, you have the brush tool and the gradient tool. You can click on the brush and you can start to paint in. So maybe I'm feeling that this part of the bowl is a little too bright, so I can paint over it. And I guess red on red doesn't really look so good. So just bear with me. And then if I come to the basic tab, you can see all of my adjustments, they reset. And the reason for that is because I have the brush selected, and you can tell I have the brush selected by coming over to the left tool panel, and you can see that I have the brush selected here. So if that was too bright, I can just pull down on the exposure, and you can see I'm making a local adjustment. And this works as expected, how you would expect it to work. So no real big difference there. Where the problem comes in is just really being able to tell what you did. So this is brush overlay, but if I had 15 of these, how would I know which brush is which? And that's why I think it's just a little clunky. Now, if you want to erase it, you can click on the eraser and it works just like an eraser does. And then, of course, you have the gradient filters where you can add in a gradient and it adds a gradient overlay over here. And then you can go and make your adjustments. So maybe I want to expose that less over there. And that's that. But I personally don't care for these overlays. So I'm going to delete them and just leave it as is. And then send it over to Affinity Photo, the raster side, and add in my own layer mask and things like that. I'm not going to do that in this particular video, but just letting you know, like, that is my thought process. Hopefully you found this content helpful. If you did, smash the like button. Let me know what you're using inside of Affinity Photo 2. And until next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.